Well, I guess it's official. With a decade now having passed since its conclusion, the 7th console generation era is now starting to enter the endlessly churning milieu of nostalgia. As someone who first really got into gaming on the 360, I can't help but feel a little twinge of longing for that era, even if it makes me feel like a decrepit old geezer to think that some of my formative gaming experiences are now borderline retro. As many issues as that era had, like the endless Call of Duty ripoffs and the shoehorn multiplayer modes, at least it was a time when a game was generally finished on launch and microtransactions were but a minor pest compared to the all-consuming plague of locusts they are today. It was in that spirit that I decided to give Gears of War 5 a spin. It's kind of fun to see what's become of all these old console-exclusive flagship IPs. God of War's transition from an edgelord hack and slash to a respected prestige narrative, while Halo was shunted off to a different developer who seems to be running it into the ground. So where does the other premier Xbox shooter brand that got handed off to a new team like an unwanted stepchild fall on that spectrum? Well, I guess it's kind of a better than I'd feared, worse than I'd hoped type situation. Not quite as complete a faceplant as Halo, but certainly not a bold revival of the franchise like God of War was either. In a lot of ways, Gears 5 is the worst kind of game to critique because there's nothing offensively wrong with it, nor are there any standout elements. As a series vet, there are a few nitpicks that I'll dig into later, but on the whole, it's just ugh. Not the most thrilling premise for a video, I'm sure, but I already put in my time, so I might as well finish up this little writing exercise. In gameplay terms, Gears 5 is a Gears game for better or worse. The fundamental gameplay feel remains consistent from when Marcus Phoenix first started stomping through the bombed out ruins of Sarah, almost 17 years ago now, Jesus Christ, ugh. Anyway, in that respect, it feels like a throwback to the omnipresent cover shooters of that era, a sort of living fossil persisting from a bygone time. Correspondingly, that means that you can probably extrapolate how you'll feel about Gears 5 based on whether or not you like the previous games. You'll be spending lots of time pirouetting through rubble-strewn corridors, hiding behind slabs of concrete with a gaggle of NPCs in tow, and hosing down bullet-spongy monsters. There's a handful of new features on offer, but they feel very much like token extras, bells and whistles added for novelty more than true innovation. Most notably, the robot companion that's been a regular feature of previous installments has now been upgraded to a full-on support NPC, and the player can order it to use various abilities mid-combat to assist. Also, in what I believe is a series first, there is a skill tree, but strangely only for the robot, not for the actual player characters. You can swap out various active and passive abilities, though some are more useful than others. Word to the wise, if you can manage to fully upgrade the ability that makes you temporarily invisible, it basically breaks the game's difficulty over your knee. The other big new feature is the inclusion of some open world elements. Don't get too excited / worried though, Gears 5 is absolutely not a sandbox game. In practice, there's a grand total of 2 semi-open areas where you can drive a vehicle around and pursue some optional objectives for upgrades. There's no vehicular combat either, your skiff is just a way to get from A to B. Enemies won't even spawn when you're on it. Basically, it boils down to a handful of optional encounters with a commute in between, not exactly revolutionary. It's the sort of tacked-on gimmick you see when developers are worried about things getting stale, but also not willing to really mess with the game's core identity. Aside from that, there's a couple new weapons and monster types in the mix, but not much to write home about. As I said earlier, it's a Gears of War game, and you probably know what to expect at this point. The weapons are still punchy and fun to use, though the series is still doggedly committed to the 2 weapon slots plus sidearm system that's increasingly been falling out of favor in recent years, so don't expect to go carrying a full arsenal on your back. As per usual for the series, it's a looker, with the weather effects in particular being quite beautiful even as they're trying to kill you. The environments are the usual cover shooter array of grey-brown ruined buildings, wastelands, and industrial areas, though I must confess I still have something of a soft spot for the art design of this series. Open world dabbling aside, it's very much a linear corridor shooter, but there's a fair few large arenas and set-piece fights to shake things up a bit, with a section set on a frozen lake with destructible ice being a particular highlight. There's also an incredibly token stealth system. Once in a while, you'll stumble on a group of enemies that haven't been alerted to your presence, and if you're so inclined, you can try to pick some off one by one by sneaking up behind them and killing them in melee. It's so bare bones that it doesn't even have a dedicated crouch button, and it's rather amusing to see how enemies don't react even as Gears' trademark walking fridges lumber up behind them without even trying to be stealthy. You can only kill the weaker monsters this way though, and the stealth is so basic you really only get the drop on some isolated goons on the fringes, so it hardly makes a difference. Like with the RPG options and the pseudo exploration, it's a token nod to innovation with no real commitment. One relic of the 7th generation that I did not miss, however, was shitty boss fights, and unfortunately Gears 5 has those in spades. There's one in particular around the halfway point that's ridiculously punishing compared to normal gameplay because the giant monster you're fighting can one-hit kill you with practically no warning. Even worse, they often involve QuickTime events, which I hadn't seen in the AAA space for quite a while. It's the sort of inorganic, lead-you-by-the-nose design that just drains all the fun and impact out of a climactic fight. Cover shooters as a genre have always had kind of an issue with boss fights, so it's not entirely unexpected, but I had kind of hoped we'd have worked out these kinks at this point. Small updates and tweaks aside though, what else is there to say really? You know what to expect. I imagine at this point you're either in or you're not. Again, it's Gears. The series hasn't really meaningfully altered its core gameplay since its inception, and I can't imagine it's about to start now. I played a couple matches of the multiplayer, and even that feels uncannily similar to how it was in the old titles, which is to say, most of the players were rolling around with shotguns. As an aside, this is a competitive multiplayer shooter that has now had like 6 entries that have all had their meta dominated by the same weapon. How is that not just an abject failure of game design? While there isn't much to say about the gameplay, I do feel a little bit more interested in digging into the narrative, because there's definitely some questionable decisions on display there. Gears 5 opens soon after the ending of the last game, and this time around, Kate Diaz, one of the major NPCs from 4, is the main character. This does run into the series' usual issue where the women have normal proportions while the men look like roid-raging Neanderthals, but hey, if it means we don't have to suffer through another game playing as JD Phoenix, I'm all for it. Anyway, in the wake of the events of the last game, where the not-so-dead after all, Locust rebranded themselves as the Swarm and launched a genocidal comeback tour, our new team of baby Gears embarks on a mission to find a super weapon to turn the tide, by which I mean using the Hammer of Dawn for the umpteenth time. Along the way, Kate grapples with her mysterious past, and we delve a little further into the franchise's mythology, such as it is, most prominently in the form of finally giving a backstory to the Locust after, 6 games of shooting the fuckers, but hey, better late than never, I guess. Gears has always had kind of a tone issue in that it tries to be both a macho power fantasy about stoic badasses blowing away hordes of slave-rank monsters, and a serious cutscene-heavy story about surviving in a ruined world, and the two parts often feel at odds. This is, after all, the series that at one point had a scene where a character had to mercy kill his mutilated, brain-dead wife in the same game as the phrase, "they're sinking cities with a giant worm." The post-epic entries in the series have tried to square this circle by adopting a more, Whedon-esque approach to dialogue, by which I mean a pervasive sense of irony without crossing over into outright parody and a heavy emphasis on rapid-fire semi-comedic throwaway lines, or, to put that more simply, quips. Scarcely a sentence goes by without some form of pseudo-witticism that kind of sounds like a joke, but doesn't quite make it there. This style has been in the center of something of a controversy in recent months, as Forspoken's commercial and critical flaying prompted a bit of a reckoning with the overabundance of quips and Marvel-style humor in modern pop culture, and yeah, in Gears 5, it gets real grating real fast. It's not quite as bad in the 4th installment was in that regard, but it's still pretty painful. None of the lines are that bad in isolation, but it just does not stop.
Block! Block!
No, 2 blocks!
Why do you think I said it twice? We might have a problem. Yeah, we definitely have a problem.
JD, how's the beacon?
Not damaged. That's the important part.
Kinda relying on you to keep it safe.
Yeah, I get it. Fate of the world, no pressure. There, done. Now let's find that office.
What does a facility commander's office even look like?
I don't know. Think a big door, nameplate, maybe commander written on it.
What now?
Let's bring that, platformy thing this way.
It's called a gantry.
Is it then? Ah, shit. Just realised. Forgot my sunscreen.
There's sunscreen.
I burn easily. Ever fight with a sunburn? It's not pleasant. Not pleasant at all.
I'll radio back to command. Maybe they can arrange for an airdrop or something.
See, you kid. But that would actually be very helpful.
Hey, more assholes in the fight fleet! Aware of how that sounded.
Well, coming to this place was certainly a life experience.
Feels like we're racking those up out here.
Thanks for being here, by the way. If you weren't with me, this would be It would be hard.
Wait, are you thanking me or Jack?
Jack, I'm sorry, wasn't that clear?
Yeah, that's a good one.
They're not funny, they don't really characterize the cast or advance the story, and they make the main characters feel kind of interchangeable. It's the dialogue equivalent of styrofoam packing peanuts, just there to take up space without any substance. The original trilogy had its share of snark, to be sure, and maybe it's just my nostalgia-addled brain, but I don't remember it being this bad. You might argue part of it comes down to the new cast being younger, but I'd counter that these are still trained soldiers in a war zone, and you can only get away with so many jokes before I start questioning why these heavily armed killers are acting more like teenagers on a school trip. Perhaps this creative decision can be boiled down to trend chasing. Gears would hardly be the first series to try imitating the MCU's comedy, but regardless of the underlying reason, I found it grating and unpleasant. It's not just that this style has been badly overexposed for the last 5 years or so, though that certainly doesn't help, but even on its own merits, it's just not very funny and it feels at odds with the context of the story. So the writing on a technical level isn't awful per se, but it does feel like pretty safe and by the numbers sort of action schlock dialogue. The pacing suffers from the usual AAA action-adventure issue where the writers pretty clearly had to work around the set pieces, but on the whole, it's just kind of forgettable, bland, the worst kind of thing to try to write engagingly about. I also played the Hivebusters DLC campaign, which came free with the Game Pass version for some reason. I did actually like the writing a little more. It's still action schlock, but the characters felt a bit scrappier and more tonally in line with the original series. But that might just be because I was playing as the Scottish guy, and anything sounds cool when you say it with a Scottish accent. The writers do a much better job of conveying character growth than in the main game, and the squad mates feel a bit more distinct personality-wise compared to their main story counterparts. I don't want to oversell it, it's certainly no masterpiece, but after the dreary slog through the main story, I was pleasantly surprised, and it's nice to see a DLC story with some real effort put into it, a rarity in today's market. That said, it does end in a pretty massive letdown. Most of the story is spent setting up for a big assault on a swarm hive, as the name of the campaign implies, but it just kind of ends right before the big event. Seriously, I got the distinct sense that there was some kind of money or time issue and the last part of the campaign had to be cut. Still, like with Bioshock 2 and Minerva's Den way back in the day, when a DLC story is the highlight of your game's narrative, that's really more of an indictment of the main campaign than anything else. Unfortunately, I can't really get into some of the more interesting creative decisions without venturing into spoiler territory, so if you just want a verdict, Gears 5 is a bland popcorn shooter with a few entertaining moments that mostly feels like a holding pattern rather than an update. Alright, from here on out, it's spoiler o'clock, so be warned. So the first thing I want to discuss is JD, because his whole character arc in this game is kind of fascinating. After spending the whole fourth game as a sort of roided up Nathan Drake, the writers apparently were as sick of his shit as I was, because about a third of the way through the game, there's a revelation that I genuinely did not see coming. Early on, we're introduced to a new character named Foz, who the main cast have a rivalry with primarily because he fired on some civilian protesters. Later, when things come to a head between them, we get this.
So, Dal, see any friendly faces you recognise? Maybe that's the peaceful protester who broke my nose.
You deserve worse than a broken nose.
Why don't you show me what I deserve?
Stop! Enough of this shit! You're a goddamn coward!
A coward? Wow. Well, have I got news?
Pause. Don't.
Guess who ordered the first shot, Del? Directly into those peaceful protesters of yours. Yeah, that's right. Lieutenant Pedigree there.
Guys. Come on, guys. Look, I mean, they were throwing incendiary... The whole thing was confusing, all right? I didn't mean to have it happen. Never mind.
Yep, Phoenix Jr. is a war criminal. When I first saw this bit, I was so on board. Finally, I thought, they're taking the Revival series in a more mature direction. JD even gets an edgy redesign after this comes out, so the writers clearly wanted this to be a big deal, which is why it's weird that he basically vanishes from the middle portion of the game entirely. And then, after several dialogues in which Kate and company lament what a dick he's become, he abruptly shows up again in the third act, briefly makes up, and Kate just lets him back into her good graces with nary a piece deep about the whole massacred civilians thing. That is the full extent of his journey. A dark revelation, we're told, not shown, that he's become a douche, and then he turns up again acting like his old self and is immediately forgiven. It's like he went through a whole character arc entirely off screen. It's gotta be one of the more egregious violations of show don't tell I've seen in quite a while. My gut tells me there was originally meant to be more to this whole thing that wound up being cut for time, money, pacing, etc., or maybe there was a disagreement between the writers as to how far to take things, and this was the compromise. Either way, as it stands, it's gotta be one of the more baffling attempts at a character arc I've seen in the game, and it's a real shame because I actually quite like the idea of the handsome golden boy hero turning out to be kind of a monster underneath, but apparently the writers didn't really want to commit to the concept. Or maybe I'm misreading things, but I don't know, having a character outed as having murdered civilians and also allowing someone else to take the blame for it seems like kind of a big development to just sweep under the rug and move on. Kate's story is at least more coherent, if not particularly interesting. It involves her discovering and grappling with her connection to the swarm/locust that was alluded to at the end of Gears 4. Gears 5 takes things into a little more of a personal direction with its new lead. There are several hallucination sequences and a lot more focus on Kate's emotional struggle. It's alright, not great, not terrible. I confess I never really got attached to Kate, but she was at least an improvement over JD in the last game, even if she's somewhat lacking in personality. I will say, however, that the underlying mechanics behind how things play out are pretty bewildering. So the big reveal is that Kate is the granddaughter of Mira, the leader of the Locust from the original games. This means that the Swarm is looking to make her their new queen because of her bloodline, the same thing they tried to do in the 4th game with Kate's mom before Kate had to mercy kill her mid-transformation. This already raises one major plot hole. Apparently, with a queen, the Swarm will become much more dangerous, which is all well and good, but they've already been launching coordinated attacks against cities for 2 games now. So I failed to see what the difference is, and they don't really behave any differently in combat post-Queenification beyond a couple of cosmetic changes and like one new weapon. Which brings me to plot hole number 2. There's a big reveal that Kate's mom actually didn't die after all when Kate killed her in the 4th game, and now she's the new queen, only it's not actually her or something. There's absolutely no explanation given for how she's suddenly back, and if the Swarm could resurrect her, why not just do that right away and skip this whole thing with trying to tempt Kate into being the queen? Ugh, I get that narrative has never exactly been the series' strong suit, and a lot of people don't give a crap about plot holes, but personally, I feel like if you're going to make me sit through a bunch of lengthy cutscenes, then the least you can do is make sure the plot is at least coherent. This isn't like an old school FPS where there's just a text screen to give you a bare minimum of context. The devs are clearly trying to tell a story here, and I think it's fair game to judge how well that story is executed in between bouts of slaughtering hordes of monsters. Another criticism I have is the one that carries over from the 4th game, and that's that the Swarm are just not very compelling as antagonists. Now don't get me wrong here, the Locust from the original trilogy were never fleshed out by any means, and they were always primarily just a bunch of big ugly monsters for the player to fight. However, I do think that the Swarm just feels a touch more generic. The design of the Locust kind of gave the feel of an alien culture with a few hints of a broader societal hierarchy, while the Storm feel more like stock video game enemies. I think a big part of it's the whole fleshy, assimilating infestation aesthetic they've got going on, complete with requisite organic growths on the walls. Between the Zerg, Flood, Infestation from Warframe, and countless other examples in sci-fi games, it feels like it's been done as a visual theme for your bad guys. I'm sure for a lot of people, one horde of monsters to shoot is as good as another, but as someone who's always liked to know a bit more about the things I'm supposed to mow down, the relative lack of effort here did kind of bug me. I'm forced to wonder if it might have been better to just come up with a new antagonist altogether, so we wouldn't have to do this whole they're new bad guys, but also actually the old bad guys too dance. I get that it's not an easy task to continue a series that the original storytellers ended pretty definitively, clearly did not have an interest in continuing, and is probably being forced into the sequel grinder by a publisher unwilling to let a potential moneymaker die, but I feel like we could have done a little better than just the Locust undied and now they're a little bit different. I actually had a bit of an epiphany playing through Gears 5 about the broader series mythology, prompted by a single throwaway line from the DLC.
My opinion? Find a plot of land far from all cog civilization. You'd be surprised how much better life can be without their constant meddling.
So what the hell you doing working for?
Good question. Why the hell do the protagonists even work for the COG? That's the Coalition of Ordered Governments, the vaguely authoritarian government that seems to be the only remaining nation state in the Gears universe. Seriously, basically every major character in the series has had an attitude towards them ranging between mild disdain and active contempt. And every single non-military COG character we've encountered has been framed as untrustworthy, self-interested, and obstructive, especially the new leader in the sequel series. According to the lore, it abandoned most of its people to the Locust while building building luxury hideaways for the elite, destroyed most of the planet as part of a Scorched Earth campaign, and as we find out in this installment, they indulged in human experimentation that created the Locust in the first place, meaning ultimately all the events of the series are their fault. There is basically nothing admirable about the COG, but each game has you willingly working for them, even as your character grumbles about it and you're constantly presented with evidence of their misdeeds. You could make the argument that they're the only option available, but I'd counter that it's the protagonists who ultimately always solve the immediate crisis, often directly going against orders in the process. A nitpick, sure, but it's never a good sign when one of my biggest takeaways from a story is a plot hole. So yeah, kind of an all over the place discussion for an all over the place narrative. I'm sure some would argue digging into the narrative of a Gears game is a bit like doing a literary analysis of a Domino's flyer, but like I alluded to earlier, I've always been of the opinion that if a game is going to have a significant narrative component, then it's a valid target for criticism, no matter how brainless. You don't spend that much time and money animating cutscenes if the player isn't supposed to be paying attention to the story. So after that meandering narrative tangent, I don't really have all that much else to say. To reiterate once again, it's Gears of War. Pretty much everyone should know what to expect going in. The only things that were noteworthy were some of the strange narrative decisions, and I walked away a bit underwhelmed. So many years after putting my Xbox 360 in storage, reconnecting with Gears has felt a bit like reconnecting with an old acquaintance, but the kind where you get excited before you notice all the annoying behaviors you had forgotten about. I'm hardly an impartial judge, having spent so much time with the originals back in the day, but after playing through Coalition's installments, I'm forced to question how much the originals really held up regardless of whatever fond memories I might have, and that's never a good position for a piece of entertainment to leave you in. Ultimately, I can't help but feel between the awkward story beats and the stagnating gameplay, maybe this series should have just been left where the original creators ended it.